All right. Go ahead and read yours. Okay, we're going to go right into our next session. And Malcolm, who presented in the last session, is going to moderate this one. So, Malcolm, take it away.
Hey, everybody. Our next session is called Nothing is That Simple, Adding Dimensions to Equity and Sustainability Tools. The first presentation is called Progress Indicators and Systems Thinking. Never the Twain Shall Meet, presented by Janine Valcour. She is the research coordinator for the Gunn Institute for Environment at the University of Vermont. Go ahead, Janine.
Sorry, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
I can.
Can you hear me out there? Yeah. Okay, great.
We can hear you.
All right, so I've got to get to my presentation. I'm going to be talking about progress indicators and progress and sustainability indicators and systems thinking. And I believe that bringing systems thinking into progress and sustainability indicators efforts will produce stronger outcomes. So why do we need indicators? What's the purpose of indicators? They provide guidepost flags, warnings on our way on a particular direction. Indicators help us to evaluate, progress, make decisions, design interventions, and achieve our shared goals. There are many efforts, past and present, to develop and use progress and sustainability indicators. Some sustainability indicator initiatives have made efforts to place indicators in some form of a framework. Many are based on the 3 pillars of sustainability: economic, social, and environmental. And here we have an example of an EPA, the Sustainability Assessment and Management Framework. GPI also uses that 3 pillars. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the SDGs. Now, the SDGs are technically not indicators, but there are underlying indicators to the SDGs, and there are also 169 targets related to the SDGs. The SDGs the Millennium Development Goals in 2000 were designed to establish measurable, universally agreed objectives for tackling pressing problems. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals were built on the basis of the Millennium Development Goals in an attempt to respond to some of the criticisms that the MDGs were facing, as they were too narrow in scope and not well equipped to address the roots of problems, among other criticisms of the MDGs. So the SDGs has an open access portal. It's the SDG Data Hub, which is the repository for sustainability indicators. And it holds information on things from, number of people living in extreme poverty to maternal deaths per 100,000 births and that sort of thing. There's a lot of indicators in there. So there were efforts also to attempt to put the SDGs into a framework. The University of Sussex with the UN and WCMC developed a framework for examining relationships between goals and an illustration of connections among goals. So these are great attempts to take what was essentially a consensus agreement and put it into a framework. The illustrations demonstrate some level of hierarchy and some interconnectedness in and among the goals. I think of this as sort of an additive approach. Despite various attempts, there's no comprehensive frame that stands out as being very useful for sustainability indicators. These approaches tend to be additive, in that indicators are developed and added into various buckets, like piles of pebbles. So here's the GPI, which is a series of indicators that add up to social, environmental, and economic well-being. But there's also the star indicators, which basically takes indicators and puts those into buckets as well. That's an effort in the US. So in my mind, this is kind of like a lot of pebbles. They're different sizes, they're different shapes, and they represent different things. You throw them into buckets, you put enough pebbles down, eventually you have a beach. Some sustainability indicator efforts, however, are making attempts to employ systems thinking approaches, which begin to provide a sort of a frame and a way of understanding the kind of complexity inherent in sustainability work. System thinking helps us to understand and account for dynamic interactions, feedback mechanisms, adaptation, and nonlinear change. We can employ a systems thinking approach to both develop a comprehensive framework for evaluating progress towards sustainability and to improve the diagnostic, intervention, and policy making value of the sustainability indicators. So can we make the whole greater than the sum of its parts? This is the role for systems thinking. System thinking is a perspective on the world that recognizes how messy it is, that everything interacts. Organizations, institutions, and people are agents in an interconnected social and economic and ecological systems. Here are some core concepts of systems. Feedback loops. Actions of a system generate change in its environment, and that change feeds back to change the system itself, like a thermostat. Adaptation, capacity or process through which systems can learn and change within their environment. Self-organizing, they develop their own structure and behavior spontaneously without being guided from top down. And emergence, agents in the system interact in apparently random ways. From all these interactions patterns emerge, which inform behavior of the agents within the system. And then thresholds are points where interactions and feedbacks cause nonlinear change. Systems thinking recognizes complexity is inherent in achieving sustainability. So some general themes to think of to apply systems thinking to sustainability indicators. I think perspective, in the interconnectedness and causal pathways. No indicator is an island. Boundaries. So when with these indicators, you define the area around a field of inquiry encompassing the interactions and entities that directly affect the problem. Entangled systems, you recognize where a system is in relation to other systems. And hierarchies, you recognize that some systems are embedded within other systems. So now, how do we apply the sustainability indicators? Well, first, we have to define sustainability. So a very common definition is the Brundtland Report, meeting our needs without jeopardizing the needs of future generations. And what about well-being? We can also look at sustainability in terms of humans and other life flourishing within an ecological threshold. So from these, I developed a vision of sustainability that includes planetary health and human well-being. And now, coupled with core systems concept, we can generate a frame for evaluating sustainability projects. Now, sustainability has been looked at in many ways, and this is the Herman Daly ultimate means, ultimate ends triangle, which there is an example. The first I found from 1998, Donella Meadows wrote a report on indicators and information systems for sustainable development, in which she employed this frame. It's a strong framework, but it was criticized for being anthropocentric. So it does a good job of covering human well-being, but what about the environment? Can we improve on this? Well, there are the 9 planetary boundaries identified by Rostrom and the Stockholm Resilience Institute. So crossing, and these are the general boundaries. If we cross these boundaries, we could generate abrupt or irreversible environmental change. So these are the boundaries that create a safe space for humanity, essentially. So how do we pull this all together? A model that acknowledges the world as easy as a complex system and incorporates planetary health and human well-being. Well, I think of a logic model. A logic model is a basic mental framework for understanding a project and outcomes. There's basic resources that you put into any project. There are activities that employ the resources. These develop outputs, and it aggregates up to some kind of outcomes. It's a basic logic model that's been used for years and years. So let's try to apply it. So we have resources as natural capital, activities, agents, feedback, interactions, patterns, output, byproducts and output, and products. And then outcomes, planetary health and well-being. Some examples, well, the examples, what are natural capital? Solar energy, earth materials, biogeochemical cycles, activities, constructing, processing, fishing, reproducing, about the things that we do and we use the resources to do. And what happens when we do the things and use the resources is that we get outcomes. We get GHG, ecosystem functions, redundancy, waste, built infrastructures. And somehow this will add up to planetary health and human well-being. So we have a bit of a frame that gives us planetary health and human well-being and a safe operating space for humanity. I also drew a little diagram of this to illustrate the way I see it. So you have your resources. On top of your resources, you have activities that use the resources. They produce outcomes, byproducts, and then it aggregates up to planetary health and human well-being. So in this frame, the leverage points, the places where you really can make policy change is here. And I think this is an important point because in some cases you find attempts to make policy changes at the output level, and that is usually like a band-aid to fix a problem, and it doesn't look at, as everybody says, the underlying issues, the causal pathways that cause the problem to begin with. So think of the example of like a disease, say high cholesterol. You could take a pill for that. You could take a pill for that and it would take care of your problem. But does it take care of the underlying issues that cause the problem? It doesn't. So when you put the indicators in a frame like this, it gives you a sense of where your leverage points are and what you really need to work on. And it also gives you a sense of what are the best indicators at each level. So resources, the information you need at the resources and activities level is causal pathways, leverage points, networks, interactions, this sort of thing. In the outputs level, you need to know how much and how many, proportions and rates. And at the indicator level, at the outcome indicator, this is where you need to know how far we are from the glacier before we're going to hit it. So this is where you need to know, like, what distance are you from tipping points and catastrophe? What points are you from success? So next steps for this sort of frame, it would be great if we could apply this, explore different scales, and refine and standardized indicators for broader adoption. I'm interested, I think this would be a whole dissertation. So I was talking really fast. So.
All right, so I'm the question caller, right?
Oh my God, I need water.
Yes.
All right, so Janine, thank you very much for your presentation. I assume you are familiar with the work of Kate Raworth, and somebody asked, I don't remember who precisely, but how does your work could be usefully compared to Raworth work?
The donut economics.
Oh, the donut economics, right. Yeah, I haven't read the book, honestly. That's a new book, and it's on my reading list, but I haven't read the book. I still think that if what I know about it is true, I don't know that it gets to the underlying systems, and it's not quite there in a frame. It's slightly different. It doesn't get to the systems, the complexity of systems as part of the model, but maybe it does, and I just don't know. So maybe, yeah. So I haven't read it, so I apologize.
No, don't apologize. Now, Eli Lazarus asked, are there examples of indicators that are representative of or in the direction of system thinking?
Well, it's not an indicator per se that is representative of systems thinking. I think we use the systems thinking frame to understand how to employ the indicators and where the leverage points are and policy points for indicators, and also to better understand the processes, the underlying processes that cause the outcomes. So the indicators are actually populating each level of the frame. So there's resource indicators, and then there would be activity indicators. But so at each point in that frame, there would be indicators, and the types of indicators would be maybe different for some of the points in the frame.
Is there enough time for one last question?
I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I lost the chat. So, all right. So I was at, how do you consider these interactions between systems, economy, society, and environment? And did you calculate, or do you plan to calculate these interactions?
Oh, I think that's, that's a huge amount of the work. That this is an idea. And I think that would be like one of 100 steps for really fleshing this out to the potential of then actually adding up to decision-making tools. So I think, I haven't done any calculations. This is just a mental model that I've come up with and a frame. So yeah, that would be an excellent task.
Thanks, Janine, for that presentation and those answers. Next up, we have Tarek Jaleb, who is a Fulbright student from Tunisia pursuing his Master's of Science in Community Development and Applied Economics at UVM. He's going to give a talk on the space between the two Kuznets curves. Go ahead, Tarek.
Thank you, Malcolm. So I guess the scope of my work is pretty much looking at the theoretical work that have been done in consideration of the two Kuznets curves, and sort of trying to reassess the assumptions and the hypothesis built by Kuznets' work earlier in the 50s. Okay. First of all, I would like to start my presentation with this quotes from Kuznets' works. Pretty much presents a nice frame from the research that I've been doing, and this pretty much says that Kuznets itself called for reconsideration in the relationship between income and especially between growth and inequality, and this emphasized that it's not only a direct relation between increase in income and a shift in equality measures, but also it's actually a consideration for the political atmosphere of a specific country and also the social pressures which sort of influence the shape of the curve that Kuznets developed. So the general outline of the presentation, I first start off with looking at the research background and pretty much go briefly with the work that Kuznets done and how that extended to developing the environmental Kuznets curve. Second, I would try and make a synthesis or summary of the theoretical findings that I've found looking through some of the work that's been done before to reassess or to look at the assumptions that have been made by Kuznets. And finally, I would provide some conclusions and some recommendation for future work in this specific field of research. So simply put, the Kuznets curve, which was developed by Kuznets in the between the 50s and the 60s, looked at the relation between income inequality and income per capita as the shape. So it's a inverted U-shaped curve, which means beyond a specific point of income, there would be a shift in inequality, which just means that inequality will start to decrease beyond a specific point. Further on, in 1991, Grossman and Kruger built on the assumption from the initial Kuznets curve to build their own curve, which pretty much perpetuates the relationship between environmental degradation and the growth in income. And it's pretty much replicates the same hypothesis, which means that the environment will start degrading at the beginning, which is reflected in developing countries, developing economies. At beyond one turning point, there would be a shift in the I would assume a shift in the investment and the interest from pursuing growth to actually pursuing environmental quality and start put money into environmental protection efforts. The implications of these two major works by Kuznets and Grossman and Kruger sort of have their own implications on the world view of development, and it built up the consideration of should we pursue development on the expense of equity, as growth, always the solution should be pursue development at the expense of environmental degradation and resource depletion, as is economic development in the sense of pursuing income growth and GDP is the ultimate goal that will remedy all other issues. And we can take the example of trickle-down economies. Pretty much as the economy grows, as GDP grows, the benefit would sort of like spreads down to the lower levels of incomes. Also, there's some implication on the world view in environmental policies. And this is saying that economic growth would be the remedy to pollution. And should we consider environmental policies at an early level of growth or maybe not at all? And we can take the example of developing countries that sort of neglect implementing any kind of environmental regulation at the early age of growth in order to promote growth itself. And also, we can also consider the fact that some of these environmental impacts that might be irreversible in their nature, so that it would be too late to actually implement any environmental policies after reaching this level of growth. In terms of the general theme of this conference, which is the economics of the Ecozoic, sort of trying to build a perception of how the economy would look in the Ecozoic era. I guess the main interest from this research is sort of like to try to build a sort of like a foundation to consider the relationship between growth, equity, and environment, which is a sort of like a three factors that have been like the major interest in sort of like trying to build up this new era of consideration for the economy. And also, is there also going to be some sort of like a trade-offs between pursuing growth and equity and the environmental degradation, or there's also like a situation where we can also have these three goals achieved equally, and we are not sort of have to sacrifice some or the others. So some of the so I sort of summarized the theoretical findings on two categories. The first one was looking at the nature of the relationship between income and equality, of course, and income and environmental degradation, and sort of like reconsidering some of the factors that have been looked on to build up these assumptions. First of all, it's not easy to consider that the relationship is monotonic, as we can see different shapes of this curve with consideration of the different dimensions of environmental quality, or also with different types of environmental indicators. The initial assumptions of the environmental questionnaire sort of utilized air and water quality as indicators for environmental qualities, but if we consider other factors, the shape might not be represented in the same form. Also, the nature of the relationship could depend on the properties of technology and preference, meaning that in some countries, technological advancements and technological innovation could actually be more of an explanation for this inverted U shape rather than only income, which sort of like makes us reconsider the direct relationship between income and environmental degradation consideration. Also, preference in terms of like people sort of trying the demand for environmental qualities overcome the demands for production products and services that are heavily polluted in their nature of production. Also, the inverted U relationship applies only to a subset of environmental measures. As I mentioned earlier, the initial work was only focusing on indicators for water quality and air quality. Also, we can explain the shape by increasing economic returns of scale for pollution abundance, meaning that the shift in investment and interest also only explained by people seeing an opportunity making profits in pursuing efforts to reduce the environmental degradation. We can also take the factor of power inequality that may also like weaken the assumption built on income alone. Previous work showed that equitable distribution of power may lead to better environmental quality. In terms of also, if we consider inequality factors, then also weaken the assumption that built upon the relationship between income and environmental degradation. Boyce's work in 1980 proved that more equitable income distribution, wider literacy, and greater political liberties and civil rights actually have a positive effect on the environment as well. The second sort of a point of summary for the theoretical findings looked at the country-specific consideration of the assumptions in these two questionnaires and the analysis bias that might have been that might have jeopardized these assumptions. The first aspect to look at is the difference between national and transnational and global, and this is in terms of considering of the increasing growth of globalization and how the shift in the curve might be, especially in higher income countries, might be explained by the fact that these countries choose to shift their polluting production to lower income countries, and this is not being considered in the earlier assumption of the Kuznets curve. We could also look at the exemption of pollution havens, where lower income countries tend to have less rigid environmental regulation, which may present opportunities for high income countries to shift their production. And this could be also looked at from a different aspect, where competition between companies, between the opportunity of lower income countries and the countries, the higher income countries, in order for them to try to maintain their companies and maintain the jobs they create within their own local economy, they might be considered to sort of soften the regulation, and may that put us in a situation where environmental degradation may increase again in the higher income countries. Also, some other factors could be taken into consideration, from political system to the type of institution within a country. We can take the example of the European Union environmental policies. Decan and Norman in their earlier work showed that if we look at a country-specific level within the European Union, we could obviously witness there are different levels of income growth between different countries within the European Union. But if we consider them together, they will actually demonstrate the same shape of curve. And this is pretty much for the this pretty much goes back to the fact that the European Union has a unified environmental policy. Also, this also leads us to assume that a one-size-fits-all approach in the consideration between the relationship between income and environmental degradation would not be really reasonable, and might actually create some bias. Some other work proved that the turning points for different countries might differ. This is according to the different levels of income within countries. Also, a lot of the work that sort of proved the assumption in Kuznets curve did not account for other explanatory variables such as unobserved time trends, measure influence, or public preference, or even chance. You can take an example like a major oil spill in a specific time frame, which sort of makes the shift of people interest. So the final conclusion or recommendation that I've sort of tried to come up with, clearly income alone should not be considered as the only explanatory variable in the consideration between growth, the relation between growth and environmental degradation. Regardless of the abundance of research that have been done on this specific subject, there is not inefficient information on the nature of relationship between income inequality, income and environmental quality, or the three together, put together. Future research obviously should focus on country-specific levels, and this is sort of building on previous work that has been done in this context. Also cross-country differences, and this is looking between the difference between developed and developing countries, and of course the effect of globalization and trade on a more global scale. We should also start to consider the approaches to development that have been implemented, and this should take in regards to the nature of time patterns between developing and developing countries. And this is sort of like looking at each country in their specific context, rather than looking at it from a more general world view of development. Thank you.
Make sure your sound's on so you can hear to listen.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So the person who used Dina Spigelski account, I know is not her. She has a she has a question. Who is it?
Covered a lot of ground. One thing that you went through briefly was the pollution haven kind of idea. Yeah. What have you found in your research that says that the Kuznets curve at kind of a global scale doesn't hold because of the trade relationship?
Sort of the work that sort of went along with the findings of Kuznets, saying that in higher income countries, they're actually showing that there are lower levels of pollution as they grow in income. And this means that they haven't taken into consideration the fact that some of the productions or the services that have been previously implemented in this country are like shifting to lower income countries, saying that lower income countries have less rigid regulation, environmental regulations. And if we do take that into consideration, then maybe the curve will not be as been assumed to be. So yeah, so lower income countries with less rigid environmental regulation are considered to be pollution havens. And this is, I guess, one consideration when addressing the relationship between income growth and environmental degradation.
So a follow-up to that, I mean, a lot of developing countries sort of, have that narrative of, well, it's our turn to grow, right? So you have to make room, but we have not enough earth left for these countries to grow, especially like we have, like the West has. Is there a narrative related to the Kuznets curve that says we can somehow drill through the curve and not have to go?
Definitely. In terms of when we consider the difference in development between different countries and different level of income countries, it would actually be reasonable to sort of, rather than developing countries taking the previous direction, that other developed countries to sort of like go through growth with no consideration to environmental degradation impacts. It would be a possible way where environmental protection efforts or policies should be implemented at an early stage, and there would be sort of an effective way to amend the effect of growth and make the environmental impacts less on a smaller scale rather than just pursuing growth regardless.
So perhaps we have time for one last question. New?
Can you turn off your mute your thing?
All right, Malcolm,
Yeah,
where'd you
thank
go?
for that. It's really interesting. And now we have Josh Farley from UVM. He's an ecological economist and professor in community development and applied economics.
Okay, hopefully everyone can hear us. Sorry, I was fumbling there in between slides. All right, Josh, take it away.
All right, if I hit that's going to go to the next slide. So, actually, how do I get to my presentation here?
Just keep going.
Oh, there we go. All right. All right. So, I thought I saw the top of Herman Daly's head briefly poke up on the screen. So, if you're here, Herman, welcome and thanks for attending. So, I want to talk about a research agenda for ecological economics, and this is something that was developed in the 1990s, and there was a book that came out on ecological economics and that developed the research agenda and goals and policy, and it had a huge impact on me. When I read that, it really motivated me to become an ecological economist. And it's probably time to re-examine this and develop a new research agenda. So really quickly, I just want to start with what we all know. So, I'm going to divide this. There's a central socio-biophysical axiom of ecological economics that the economy is embedded in society, and these are part of a continually evolving subsystem of a complex, finite global ecosystem, subject to the laws of physics and ecology. We all get that, but these are the things that determine what our research agenda should be. Our central behavioral axiom is that humans evolved as social animals, persons in community. We're capable of a wide range of behaviors, ranging from self-interest to altruism, driven by emotions, intuition, as well as rational decision-making. So we're really complex behavior. And then we have these three goals we pursue, which is sustainable scale, just distribution, efficient allocation. With the last one I'm defining here is how do we meet basic needs and provide fulfilling lives at the lowest ecological cost. So that's just super overview, a 30-second synopsis is more than enough. But these are the issues and beliefs that drive a research agenda. And so what's the current status of the field? So I would argue it's undergoing a bunch of intense internal debates that are dividing the field. That we started out with a whole bunch of different people kind of collectively together pursuing shared goals, and we're dividing into smaller and smaller little niches pursuing ideological purity often. One big driver of this is the role of markets and prices in an ecological economy. So do we have too much confidence in the role of markets? And I distinguish markets from neoclassical economic theories of markets, which are, I would argue, two very distinct things. and the role of market prices. And and I'll get back to this, but this could be really, really important because, what we do and pursue can change our behavior. Another big issue is, and actually one thing I want to say is that I think a lot of this debate between the role of markets and prices, there's a schism between Europe and the US, quite possibly because in US society, we are so market driven, as somebody earlier said, that we can conceive the end of humanity easier than we can the end of capitalism. And in our education, there's less of a role for alternative views. And in the policy sphere in the US, there's perhaps less of a role of alternative views. And as Herman Daly once said, we have to begin from historical conditions. So, part of this debate might be the different historical conditions that Europe and the US find themselves in. The other big question is the relevance of social and political power, political economy. How much do we really have to pay attention to unequal power distribution? Another really big issue is this, is it enough to change things around the edges, or do we need radical change? So a lot of economics is based on marginal valuation, yet we live in a world with these ecological thresholds with radically non-marginal outcomes from marginal changes in our activity levels. And so some people think we can internalize externalities, we just change prices, that's enough as long as we pay attention to ecosystems. Other people believe we need a radically new economic system. And this is a quote from a last email I got from Herman Daly. It's not a quote, but I took it from him. And it's his view that, just small empirical questions with potentially definite answers add up to answers to big questions. And a lot of people are focusing on small little valuation topics or small little things and really neglecting these very big questions about, what should be the basic economic institutions we need. I would argue that ecological economics has failed to thrive. When I first discovered this, I thought in 10 years, everybody will be ecological economists. And that was, 25 years ago. And we don't see econ programs teaching ecological economics. We don't see a proliferation of programs across the country. We don't see that much impact on policy. There is an alternative way to look at this, though, that there's a lot of transdisciplinary fields with very similar goals and values that have proliferated. And the question is how much we want to distinguish ourselves from those or be part of one general movement with shared worldviews and shared goals. So these are just some of the current status of the field. And so a research agenda is, what are the questions we have to answer to advance this field and achieve our goals? And there's a big debate here. I would argue, there's an awful lot of people focusing on a better understanding of biophysical processes. I wonder whether more science is going to get us there or whether we need a better understanding of cultural transitions. What changes people's minds? These are big questions. And they're not just the questions, the research agenda is not just driven by empirical science, but also has to look at ethics and values. What are the appropriate values we should pursue, which determine our goals? So it's not like, which is hard to think of in terms of a research agenda. And I just have time to highlight a couple of items. So one I want to look at really right at the roots of this is we face irreducible uncertainty. There's ecological thresholds that we can't predict where they are, when they're going to happen. We have a sample size of one planet. There's cultural and technological change continually ongoing. We can't produce the next big technologies and whether they'll have negative or positive impacts. And so we have this, one big challenge is, do we live in a deterministic world as Einstein believed, as Stoltzman's concept of thermodynamics implies? Or is there pure uncertainty and we don't know the future? Prigogine, for example, says that there are pure uncertainty, that far from equilibrium thermodynamic systems are radically different than near to equilibrium systems. There's pure uncertainty. And Herman really raised the importance of this to me, is if we do believe in determinism, everybody understands uncertainty. Nobody believes that we can understand the future or know what will happen, but many do believe the future is deterministic. And if the future is predetermined, essentially, then policy makes no sense. Our beliefs make no sense. Nothing matters. If we have that belief, it's just going to go, and why even pay attention to it? So that's a really important issue for how we're going to behave. Another big issue is this part versus the whole. So Descartes really had this believed in this reductionist science. If we understand the individual components, we have a better understanding of the whole. He viewed life is just another type of machine, whereas Whitehead believed it's the interactions between the different elements that's really, really important, and which means we need a much more holistic systems-based science. So I think that's an important part of the research agenda that's going to determine where we go. And this also looks at logical positivism as this belief that there's a real reality out there and we are capable of understanding it and we can keep moving in that direction. Critical realism is that there's a reality out there that's too complex to understand, but it is a reality and we have to understand it as best we can and act within our uncertainty. And then there's this concept that might seem a little silly, reality as a social construct. And somebody published an article, using sociological jargon, arguing that gravity was a social construct. And that's clearly absurd. But I actually think that in social systems, our theories have a major influence upon reality, and a major influence, in fact, even upon our behavior. So, going back to Janine's presentation, if we have theories of what is the desirable ends or how we measure, well-being, that might change what makes us feel good about ourselves. You go to Bhutan and everybody's super excited about the happiness thing. That makes them really excited. So reality, I think social reality, our theories have big impacts on what's going on. So I think those are important things to look at, and they make a big difference in how we pursue the field. If our theories change reality, we have to bear in mind how that could happen. And we have to figure out, again, this irreducible uncertainty, I think, is one of the most important elements that is widely ignored among scientists in general, and even within ecological economics, and particularly economists. How do we model these complex, uncertain systems? We always are going to be wrong. We have to wonder to what extent the past predicts the future. So Tarek's presentation on Kuznets curves. There was a period perhaps where wealthier nations decided to focus more on the environment, and we got more equality in wealthier nations. But if we live in a continually evolving economic system, how much can we rely on those past events to predict what will happen in the future? And as we see radically increasing inequality in some of the world's richest nations and also in some of the poorer nations. So these are big questions we don't have an answer to. And then how do we make decisions based on our models when our decisions, we're going to continually unfold in a continually changing reality? And there's major ethical implications to this. So what we decide to do, I believe we're dealing with gambles where we have unknown probabilities. We don't know what the results are, and we don't know the payoffs. And often the impacts are on future generations. And you can't answer, how we manage those gambles with science. We really have to think about the ethics very deeply. So I think that's a big element of the research agenda. All right, 2 minutes. So other big thing is the ultimate and proximate cause of human behavior. So we have genetic and cultural evolution. Humans evolved in the savannas of Africa in small bands, lots of evidence that those bands that could most cooperate outcompeted other bands, while individuals within the bands who are most selfish might have outcompeted other individuals within that band. So we have genetic pressures or evolutionary pressures for cooperation and competition. And social institutions can profoundly affect our behavior. Lots of evidence that markets lead people to be more selfish, less pro-social, less interested in others. Money has the same thing. Money is a way we could cooperate across distances without trusting each other. There's evidence that reciprocity fundamentally changes our behavior. There's a click-where response. Somebody does something nice to you, you want to do something nice to them. How we frame our problems has a huge impact on how we respond. And I have these images here of social evolution and of human decision making. And I think those are absolutely wrong. We are social animals. Every time you look at any image of evolution, it shows humans as individuals. It doesn't talk about the cultural role. It's this way we, believe that we are individuals, freedom is what matters. I think that's the wrong way to look at things. We're social organisms embedded in society. And then we have to use this knowledge to create an ecological economy. We need a theory of change. Many of us believe we do the science, policymakers will act. And it's rational thought. There's another big field that says, actually, rationality is a recent addition to the human brain, and we are primarily emotional, intuitive, instinctual, and that determines our behavior. And we see this in we need cultural transitions that require our understanding of how to make these big changes. And I would argue one of the big changes we need to make and we need to understand is how to solve prisoners' dilemmas, which can't be solved by markets. Most of the challenges we face, acting in your own individual self-interest, will lead people to defect for the worse off, for the ill-being of society. So I think these are the big challenges we face. We need to measure and achieve sustainable well-being. And this is a big question for who, for whom? Moral standing. Is it for humans? Is it for all animals? Is it an anthropocentric, an ecocentric, or a system-centric perspective, recognizing that humans are embedded in the global ecosystem and depend on that well-functioning system for our well-being? We have to, figure out how to quantify quality of life. There's this big issue of dematerialization, which a lot of people, this technology can dematerialize. We can survive without natural resources. Everything is substitutable. And we do continually develop new technologies. CRISPR-Cas9 will allow us to feed a lot more people, possibly with less harm. But the big approach to materialization, I would argue, is degrowth. How do we achieve this through degrowth? And since I have like 30 seconds, I'm a little quick here. I just want to say that, we need to figure out what institutions, norms, and rules will be required. And this is really important, not just markets, but democratic processes, cooperation, et cetera, figuring out what institutions will leverage change most effectively, where the path we pursue is determined by the characteristics of the resources and the desired goals. And then finally, the big question is, who should determine this research agenda? Should it be a bunch of old white guys who, so in a way you could look at the elders in the field, or is it the next generation of ecological economists who have to pursue this agenda and who will be living in a world, where we need to develop this ecological civilization? And we have two initiatives going on right now. Kansi has a workshop to focus on the next 50 years of ecological economics, and it's going to result in a special issue of the journal Sustainability, which will also be a book. And the UVM is having a workshop here this summer on a research agenda for ecological economics, which will result in an edited book. And we would really like the young, diverse group of students in this course and in the Economics for the Anthropocene and Leadership for the Ecozoic to be the leaders in this effort and to come and help us lay out this research agenda and figure out where we do need to go for the next 50 years if this field and this planet are to survive. I'm still got 10 minutes.
Great.
Josh, a question for you. So what if new science is emerging, which might by its nature bring forth better integration of knowledge and wisdom? So can we be open to the possibility of a new scientific worldview emerging?
Yeah, so I think they're absolutely so there's, we have to be open to this possibility of a new worldview emerging. I think too often scientists get obsessed with the narrow constraints of their field and pursue one path and are too often blind to other options. And our universities really have to take a different approach to education and to science education and to recognize that if we narrow our boundaries of research, it narrows our boundaries of solutions and channels us in single directions. And it's really problematic. And I think we really lack wisdom in most of the social and physical sciences. our boundaries are too narrow, and we have to redefine the way we teach. I don't know if that answered the question or not, but.
I do have a practical question here. Is there, and if yes, what is the relationship between the CANSI workshop and the UVM workshop?
So they both were initiated separately, and but with remarkably similar goals. I mean, Katie Kish has been organizing the CANSI workshop and was planning on having a book and a special issue of a journal, and she was really focusing on the upcoming generation and more radical perspectives. Bob Costanza approached me about co-editing a book, and we developed a UVM workshop out of that. And in some ways, I would say that workshop, because the people involved, is a little bit less open to broad views. So I approached Katie Kish, and we're going to co-edit the sustainability, special issue sustainability, and the book. Katie will come to our workshop to present the the results of what the outcomes were from the CANSI workshop. And in some ways, they will be complementary rather than competing views of where we should go. But with as much, really cooperating on.
I think Katie's at McGill right now. Katie, if you want to add anything, jump in.
Yeah, no, they did evolve sort of separately, and I'm glad that it got brought to Josh's attention and that it did loop in. And I think that the CANSI workshop is going to be very much about this new group of people and what they're thinking, and the research coming out of E4A and the new L4E group, and how that's going to contribute to a more broad and diverse discussion about these issues that will start to answer a lot of these questions that Josh has brought up. I mean, the questions that he's put on here have really, I mean, there are some good beginnings of answers, some good seeds from students already, and it's really encouraging. So I think that it'll be an encouraging project to get that book out alongside of one that might be a little bit more, it's kind of funny to say, a little bit more mainstream in such a sort of already non-mainstream group of people, but it will be a little bit more than perhaps the other, but they'll still speak to one another quite a lot, I think.
And I think I think we both kind of have a shared goal of, let's collaborate towards our shared goals and stop attacking each other for, on the basis of ideological purity.
Yeah, absolutely.
We agree.
So is there still time for me to ask a question? There was no other question I really wish to ask Josh.
One final question, and then we'll take a quick break before our last session.
All right, Josh, based on your presentation, you've seen mine about applying the tools of ecological economics to understand the past. Do you think that, at least scientifically speaking, using our paradigm to understand what went wrong, do you think it is useful for all the perspectives ecological economists are trying to deal with? So not only scientific, but social, political, etc. So in other words, dealing with history, is it just academic, or is there a social use to it as well?
Yeah. So I think it's really, really important to understand history, and what we do now has huge impacts upon the future. I think we have to refrain from thinking, a lot of mainstream economists view the system is kind of non-changing. There's certain human behaviors that are unchangeable, and the economic system, economic motivations and incentives are constant across cultures and time. That's what I think is ridiculous to believe. I think we have an evolving system in which human behavior can evolve if we change our institutions, and human behavior has evolved dramatically. So, and I think, for example, money, going back to your presentation, the role of money continually evolves, and it has unsuspected impacts on human behavior. So I really believe we're social organisms, and our success has depended on our ability to evolve new institutions that allow us to collaborate over larger and larger groups. And, first it was the band. We'd collaborate with people within our band. Then we developed nationalism and religion. We'd collaborate. We'd trust people who had our nationality or our religion. Money evolved is a way to collaborate with people you didn't trust. And it really has bizarre impacts on human behavior. it really does make people in some ways less cooperative and less social, while in other ways allowing us to collaborate and cooperate across unprecedented numbers of people and geographical and spatial scales. It's continually changing, and I think there's been radical transformations in the monetary and financial system since I did my PhD. And as radical as many of the transformations we're calling for in the ecological economy. So I look at this as, a lot of people say, well, you're calling for too much radical change. And I would argue, actually, we're undergoing that kind of radical change. We just want to redirect it in a way that's, more desirable and more sustainable.